Hello and welcome. I'm Stephen Goldberg of Optimus Performance, bringing you practical tips and ideas on leadership, team development, and employee performance in the workplace. As you can see, I have a special guest with me. I'm very happy to introduce Matthew Richter of the Tyagi Group and other organizations as well. Matthew, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about
Sure.
your background and what you're involved in?
Sure. I'm a trainer, a consultant. I'm a learning science train the trainer. Uh, and I've been working with Tiagi for a little under 30 years now. And Tiagi and I are a two-person group. He's the CEO, and I'm the lowest ranking person in the company as but he still calls me the president. So I don't know what that means. But and then Tiagi and I are 50% owners of an organization called the Learning Development Accelerator, which is a professional community for learning and development practitioners. And we're small, but we have members from all continents except Antarctica. And we leverage evidence-based, evidence-informed techniques for making learning more effective. So we're really focused on what does the science say about learning? What does the science say about learning and development? And how can we practically take that science and put it in practice?
Fantastic. Um, I first met you and Tyagi. Is it Tyagi, huh?
Tiagi.
Tyagi. Okay.
Yeah.
I first met you guys at a 2-day workshop on interactive training techniques way back when. I think it was in New Orleans.
And do
And
we owe you your money back?
actually, I got a lot out of that training, and I converted a lot of my training exercises or delivery incorporated. I couldn't say convert, but I incorporated a lot of interactive activities, which I think was well received by the participants and helped create greater engagement and hopefully learning as well. So I want to talk about that because you have a new book that you
Yeah,
co-authored. You want to show that?
sure. It's called
Interactive.
Interactive Techniques for Learning.
Okay. So let's talk about the approach. What does it mean, interactive techniques for learning versus uh, another style of learning, which I would say more is what we experience in school and university, where it's more lecture based and you're consuming the information. What's the difference and why do you
Sure.
promote this?
So, the way we like to think about things is that there are three components to learning. There's the content, and the content can be delivered effectively as a lecture. It can be a book, it can be text, it could be a video, a podcast, but there's content, right? So, content has to get into the learner somehow. The second thing is an activity, and we use activities to wrap around that content to help facilitate the journey of going from outside the person into the person, right? And technically, by the way, learning is essentially just a stable, sustained change in long-term memory. So, how do we get that content into a person's long-term memory so that they can apply it as a skill later? So we use activities to take that content and get it into their memories. And then, of course, you have the learning objective or the learning outcome. In other words, what do we want people to do differently as a result of taking that content and going through an activity and memorizing? So we have content plus activity and the objective to get to the objective. So those are the three components.
And so, what evidence is there, or I guess, yeah, we talked about evidence before we started recording, that um, kind of proves or promotes the idea that interactive training techniques is more effective in terms of uh, uh, the learner actually acquiring and applying whatever it is, the content, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
versus a lecture style approach.
So we have to be careful what we're asking here. So if we're asking, does interactivity in general improve learning outcomes? The answer is maybe. And the reason it's maybe is because we have to make sure that the instructional design, the pedagogy associated with it, the instructional methods we use align to that objective. And when we're measuring whether a participant or a student has learned something, we have to assess whether they've successfully done so, right? And so when we build a design that uses interactivity appropriately, meaning it aligns to that objective, and then we get that result, we get better results than if we just ask the student to read or listen or passively engage with that content on their own. And so wrapping activities appropriately in an aligned way to the objective increases significantly the impact that the learning outcome has. And there are tons of studies. I can give you a bibliography if you want to post it onto your show site or show notes without boring people, but I have a fairly big bibliography we can give you if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be interesting to refer to.
Sure.
Um, when it comes to the content, because in the workplace, practically, people need to teach their employees a variety of things from how to operate a machine, let's say.
Yeah.
So, typically referred to as hard skills aligned with being able to perform the job. And then on the other side, you have what's often referred to as soft skills or people skills to be able to interact with their colleagues or customers or whatever, collaborate. Is interactive training techniques effective for both, or is it more effective and can it be used for both?
Of course. Yeah. Absolutely. And again, if we think about what people are learning, if I'm learning how to have a conversation with you effectively, or I'm learning how to appropriately use a shutdown process for a nuclear power plant in an emergency. Both involve having some principles associated with them. Both involve having a process. Both involve decision-making points. At this point, you make a decision to go left or right or push this button or that button or say X. Both involve some concepts around values. Both use models or ways to develop to cohesively all that information in your head. So sometimes we mistakenly differentiate hard skills and soft skills, and I think that's a mistake.
Mhm.
What we really want to do is think about what is it I'm trying to teach and what is the content we need to teach them. And then how do we get them to develop fluency recalling that information in practice? In other words, building the skill, right? Mastering that skill. And we do all of that interactively. So if I'm learning the procedure for safely shutting down a nuclear power plant, we use interactive techniques. If I'm teaching people how to have a difficult conversation, we use interactive techniques. Now, one of the most important things that I think we forget in both categories is the role that context plays. If you're learning how to shut down a nuclear power plant safely, there's a context of the machines that are involved, there's the politics of the plant, there's the systems that it's all plugged into. So there are contextual factors. The same is true when you're learning how to have a difficult conversation. Are you giving a patient devastating bad news about their health? Or are you talking to a client to deliver bad news? Or are you having to tell an employee that they might be out of a job? And those contexts change how that content is put into your brain. right? Because you need to have specific vocabulary, you need to understand the nuances of that context. And so context is imperative for us to take into account when we're building interactive training. It has to be not only contextual, but relevant to the people so that they can apply it fluently later on.
So if we go back to your example of the shutting down a nuclear
Yeah,
plant, the machinery involved, I guess, the controls, like you need to actually either have a simulator or be in the workplace where the machine is operating to show people to demonstrate, I would imagine. So, how would interactive techniques be involved in that? Would it be like
yeah.
simulation would be the
I wouldn't put them in a simulation right away. What I would do is actually give them classroom time and run what we call interactive lecture activities and texture activities, which are activities that use text, and other debriefing activities to make sure that they understand the process first, what the different components are of the shutdown machinery. And we're way beyond my technical acumen for nuclear power plant, right? Make sure they know the vocabulary. I would also pay attention to their expertise level and prior knowledge, right? Are these engineers or are they newbies who are backup plan, right? There's some contextual factors there. Are these people who wrote the instruction manual and we're just teaching them how to use a new machine? Or are these people who've never touched a machine before? And so we need to make sure that that vocabulary, the procedures, the principles behind it are all in their heads first. Now, we might run a low fidelity simulation to just kind of ingrain some of that in their brains. Now we'll move them into the simulation. Then we'll do some activities, maybe where they're paired off with experts in a real life simulation using a real life tool and so forth. But we stage them through. We'll also use some instructional techniques like spaced repetition. We won't teach them all this stuff in one day. Why? Because humans have what's called a forgetting moment. There's a forgetting curve where you learn something, then you forget it. You learn a little bit more, you forget it. And so we need to space out this kind of learning so that people are able to just build up fluency into their long-term brains, long-term memories to make it work. So all of it's interactive, but I don't throw them into a simulation till they're ready to go into the simulation.
so you need to be a good instructional designer to understand, um, to consider all these aspects or components of what the person needs to go through to learn that, and then design the training based
You
on.
mean, do I need to be a subject matter expert?
Well,
Is that
that's another question I was going to get to because that's often what I see happening where, especially for complex subjects,
yeah.
a company will bring in an expert and have them do a training or give a lecture. And because that person is known to be a subject matter expert, they expect people to be able to learn, but that's not always
Mhm.
successful. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, so I first of all, I think all learning designers, all instructional designers, all trainers should know how learning happens psychologically. And so I'm a big believer in the work of Paul Kirshner and John Sweller and Richard Mayer, who have done tremendous work outlining the cognitive architecture for how the brain takes in information, processes that information in short-term memory or working memory, moves it into long-term memory, and then you practice retrieving it and applying it and so forth. And so if we designers don't understand that science, then it makes it very hard for us to design activities, choose the appropriate level of content, space it out, make sure that we're sequencing it properly and so forth, developing proper worked examples and demonstrations and so forth. So we got to know our stuff. As educators, we should understand how people are educated. I don't need to be the expert, though, on nuclear power plants. I can partner with the subject matter expert where I'm the expert in the process of learning, and the subject matter expert is the expert in the subject matter. But that's where I point to the subject matter expert and say, insert your content here. And when we are providing feedback, that's where you still come into play because I can't give feedback. And well, we may have experts who are participants, they can give each other feedback. We definitely don't want novices giving each other feedback because novices tend to be wrong. And the worst thing you want is for wrong information in a power plant shutdown process, right? So we want to make sure that we're processing even feedback properly through subject matter experts at that point. The same is true for soft skills, right? If you're learning how to give difficult information to a patient in a medical situation or medical context, I probably want to have a doctor validating that you're getting the vocabulary right. I can validate whether they're doing the process right for having that difficult conversation. And so we partner together. I think I did I answer both of those questions?
Yeah, you did. And
Good.
that makes total sense. And I think it's kind of a mistake that companies make, especially smaller companies where, they bring in a subject matter expert and expect them
Yeah,
to create a change or educate people.
right.
But it often ends up just in education, which again slips away quite easily. Um,
Yeah, well, asking people to stand up and give a lecture when they're a subject matter expert and not wrapping instruction around it is well, frankly, dumb. It's useless. It's like giving someone a book and asking them to internalize that book with
right.
with no support. Um, but you know, there's a huge mistake in the psychology. They call it explicit or direct instruction, right? That's what we view as traditional learning, right? So inaccurately, we think of that as the deadly dull boring lecture or the text assignment where you have to go read something. And no one is advocating for singular lectures as an effective way to teach. Explicit instruction, direct instruction is guided instruction with instructional design wrapped around it, right? So it's where the instructor is in charge of guiding the experience, designing and laying out the experience. That doesn't mean we take away the sense of autonomy from the learners. We absolutely want to make sure people are volitionally engaging in the experience. We absolutely want learners to feel engaged and happy to be there. We know that when you are more intrinsically motivated to learn a topic, you do the work because it's meaningful to you. And so we don't want to bore the hell out of people, and it's nowhere implied in the work from these folks that direct instruction does that. It's a misunderstanding of it.
So, how can a manager that needs to train his employees or bring in an expert to train their employees, how can they incorporate these approaches when they don't have the same amount of resources that a larger company may
Well,
have?
I think that's a super question. And and I don't have a very good answer because a lot of times we'll get hired, for example, to come in and do a 2-day program.
Yeah.
And I do a lot, by the way, I didn't say this in the introduction, but I specialize in management and leadership development and how to create more motivating work environments. And so I do that. I do the train the trainer stuff and so when we get asked to do this, I get in trouble because I don't want to go in and do a 2-day program. 2-day programs don't transfer. And if you don't have the managers working in conjunction with you on how to reinforce what you just taught back in the workflow, it's a waste of time. And so how do we, and if I only do 2 days and there's nothing as follow-up, it's, I mean, just think of that forgetting curve I alluded to, right? They really did well. They got it walking out of the class, but the next day, I can't remember the number. I think it's 30% or is gone, 70% is gone by 2 days. I mean, it's insane. People forget everything. So what are we doing when we do these 2 day workshops and then nothing after we've just thrown money away and very little gets done? Now, what do people remember? Well, they remember the fun games we did. They remember the jokes. Tiagi tells a great story about the impact of storytelling. And when we teach trainers how to use storytelling, he always opens up with this. And he says that our friend Ray Jimenez said, "Hey, you should build storytelling activities into your work. That'll go off very well." And so Tiagi said, "That's a great idea, but I want to test it out." So he told a bunch of stories in the program, and then he sent some graduate students to go out and check in with the learners to see what they remembered, what they're putting into practice. And the student came back and said, "I have good news and I have bad news." And the good news is they loved your stories. They remember all of your stories. The bad news is they don't know why you told them. And and so that's one of the reasons why we really strongly believe not only do you have to not tell stories passively, right? You have to get participants to engage in the story itself. But after the training, nothing's happening for people to remember the learning part, which requires practice, feedback, more practice. Hey, let me remediate and get some more information that I forgot. Let me review and so forth. And we don't do that. And so it's a waste of time. And so small companies, they have small budgets. So what happens? They buy the smallest, littlest amount they can afford and they hope for the best, and it doesn't work. What do the big companies do? They have the money, but they don't want to invest in the time. And so you get the same impact. And so we have a problem, I think. We don't do what's required for real learning to happen. And
So it's
most companies are not willing to do the evaluation,
right.
right? They just do smiley sheets. Smiley sheets are not indicators of learning.
No. So it's really about using effective learning approaches to engage and transfer the skill or the knowledge. And then I guess the harder part is the follow up by management. And I guess it's the commitment to the process where you have um, people that are ready to invest the time and the resources to make sure that whatever's being taught actually gets implemented and measured, is what you're saying, I think.
Exactly. And we don't want to conflate people having had a good time with effective learning. You know, it really bothers me when people say that was great. Well, are you able to do what we were teaching?
Right.
What did you teach us again? No, then it was a failure and it wasn't great. People had a good experience. That's important. Don't get me wrong. Good experiences are important, but they don't equal learning outcomes.
I guess learning how to drive may be a good example of a
Yeah,
process that works because you're actually evaluated and there's a system in place to make sure that you follow the rules, what you learn. Otherwise,
right.
you pay the price, right?
That's a fantastic example because it also shows the different levels we need to target learning at, right? So if I'm taking when my kid was 16 and we are trying to teach her to drive, right? We were focusing our objectives on getting her from A to B without getting hurt, without hurting anyone else, without hurting the car, without breaking any laws, and getting there smoothly, right? So those were the objectives. That right. But if we were teaching someone to drive in a Formula One race, well, they already do all that. So
Right.
now we're teaching them a much higher set of skills. And so we're level setting the objectives differently. And so that brings in a different factor. We've talked about context, we've talked about instructional goals. We also need to take into account the level of expertise and how that levels up or down the objectives. So there are lots of factors.
Now let me ask you about presentations, like salespeople that need to
Yeah.
go make a presentation based on prior conversations with a potential client. Often it's done, well, today it's even done over Zoom or whatever, but
Yeah.
I prefer face-to-face presentations. Can your techniques be used by salespeople to help them make a better presentation and get the client involved and having them seeing them using the product to improve a sales result?
So again, yes and no. Depends
Okay.
on your objective, right? And again, it's a different context. My objective is teaching, right? So
Right.
we're instructional in our basis. Tiagi and I, by the way, we're not process facilitators. So a lot of folks can use our activities to do process facilitation. But what we do is we teach. And so our context is instructional. Sales is a totally different context. So if I'm making a presentation to a client, the objective is that they remember one or two key ideas and that they're going to hire me and do something. I'm not asking them to perform a skill. I'm
Right.
not asking them to do something behaviorally different other than hiring me in that sales call.
But you're still educating them to a certain degree because they may not understand, they may have a problem that the salesperson wants to provide a solution uh, will understand their problem and what's causing it, and then offer a solution
Well, yes and
and
no.
has to educate them on why that solution is the right one for them.
In the sales call,
Yeah.
I want them to authentically, I'm not trying to pull the wool over their eyes. I want them to authentically believe that I do indeed understand their problem and I'm the one who has the solution.
Right.
And so I need to use stories. I need to use good communication skills. I need to present enough information in a captivating way that they remember it the way people remember Tiagi's story, and they sign the contract. Now, the contract for me then is to teach people stuff. But if it's to fix a core technical business problem, then the outcome is we go in and fix that core technical problem. And then we have another sales conversation or at least an account management conversation to update the client and so forth. In other words, the conversations are different. I'm not actually teaching in a sales call. I might want to indicate that I get it, but that's a different level of measurement of learning than I'm putting you into a training workshop and I need to evaluate whether or measure whether you've effectively learned the information and a skill. It's at a different level with a different set of objectives.
Okay.
Now, can you use those activities? Yes, I use jolts. Jolts are very short metaphorical simulations that take maybe anywhere from 15 seconds to 2 minutes to run, and then you can debrief them. And I'll often use, because I'm selling training, right? I'm selling learning interventions. I will use a jolt in the sales process to both demonstrate our activities as well as anchor an idea that we can call back to in the sales process. And so you can use jolts easily in sales conversations.
Okay. Yeah, I remember the jolts, and that's in your book as well.
Yes, yes.
So you give a framework how to use jolts and then fill it with your own content relevant.
Jolts, you don't, jolts are simulations.
Okay.
So the jolt is the same all the time, but we can debrief it in a myriad of different contexts. So the what's shifting is the context in which you debrief it. So how you debrief it changes, but the jolt itself is the same. So for example, is this a video or is this audio?
A video.
Okay, so if I ask everyone to take their hands, put them out like this. Go ahead, Stephen. And I'm going to count one, two, three, and then I'm going
Hold
to
on,
say
let me
clap.
switch the view. Let me switch the view to gallery here. Okay, go
All
ahead.
right. So I'm going to count one, two, three, and then I'm going to say clap. When I say clap, I want everyone watching this video to clap simultaneously. So one, two, three. I say clap. What do you all do? Very good. Very good. So are you ready?
Yeah.
One, two, three, clap. Now, very few of you waited until I said clap.
Right.
Probably most of you clapped when I clapped. Now we can debrief around how modeled behavior is often much more powerful than the spoken instruction. In other words, do as I say, not as I do,
Right.
or do as I do, not as I say. Right? We can go any direction. That's an example of a jolt that we can use to anchor the concept of modeling when you're a manager, or modeling as a leader, or modeling when you're a teacher, or modeling when you're a trainer, and so forth. So that's an example of one jolt. How long did that take? Maybe a minute to run. And now we can keep anchoring the concept back to it. So you remember one, two, three, clap? Great. How did you feel with that? Great. Let's talk about how we can take that principle and apply that. Great. Blah, blah, blah. Blah,
Fantastic.
blah, blah is a technical term.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you said something right there. Do as I do, do as I say, not as I do, or vice versa, which made me think of leadership because
Mm-hmm.
you're also expert in leadership development. Your previous book is on leadership, and the new one that's coming out, where you already have the booklet. Let's talk a little bit about that upcoming book and what you've written so far. I don't know if you
Sure.
have it handy. You could show it on screen.
Well, I don't have a cover yet for it either. So,
Okay.
but I wrote a little booklet last year on issues around leadership development. So traditional leadership development, I would argue, doesn't work. And it's not me that thinks that. It's people like Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford University. He wrote a wonderful book called Leadership BS. That and he walks through all the research or lack thereof on why traditional leadership development has failed, even though we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars annually trying to do it. And yet, if that investment is returning so little, why do we continue to do it? And there are lots of reasons for that. But Barbara Kellerman, who's a professor at Harvard, has independently done her own work on why leadership development fails. Ronald Riggio has done the same thing. There is tons of research to indicate that leadership development, traditionally done, doesn't work. And so what I wanted to do was first to explore why I think that doesn't happen. And one of the reasons is consistency, right? There's a definitional problem. What are we teaching? And when we tend to go to executives and we say, hey, you tell us what leadership is. Well, what the hell do they know? They don't know. They're busy running the company and they're not leadership scholars. They're not researchers. They're not thinking about it as a model. That's not their job. That's not what they know. Or we go out and we buy a model, right? You might go out and buy servant leadership or situational leadership or any of these tools out there and try and embed those into your organization. But do those models work? Do they work all the time? Well, they tend not to work all the time because context, which is problem number two, gets in the way. And context, of course, is what works today to solve a problem in leadership won't work tomorrow. And what works tomorrow won't work the next day. And why? Because the context keeps shifting and we have different problems that require different approaches, different skills, different values, and so forth. Well, okay, that's all fine. But hey, I really want my servant leadership, or I really want the model we're buying, or we want the thing that the executives want. Well, what about the validity and reliability of that? Does what you're trying to put into place actually do what it says it does, validity? And does it do it in all settings, reliability? In other words, can we replicate that? No. The answer is no, we don't get that. Sometimes for external reasons like context, and other times because no one's actually tested the model. It just was a cool idea that someone wrote down. And so we have these great ideas, but when we start to actually test them out, see if they work in multiple settings, multiple contexts, we don't get any return. And then finally, the executives all say one thing, we bring in a model, but then all the behaviors that are actually reinforced in the organization are in direct conflict with that. So we have misaligned goals, misaligned values. And so all of these things happen. For example, we tend to only say that we want the positive traits or attributes or skills. We don't seem to allow for any of the negative behaviors or skills that are often associated with leadership success. The traditional person that people hold up lately is Steve Jobs, right? He wasn't apparently a very supportive or nice guy. He wasn't that empathic in his leadership approach. Okay, fine. But was he a successful leader? Well, it depends on which metrics we use to evaluate it. But yeah, overall, people would argue he did pretty well. And yet he wasn't the nicest person. So do we just dismiss those negative attributes, negative characteristics, and ignore them? Or do we think of it more systemically? So that's the framework. But my friend Nigel Payne keeps yelling at me and saying, hey, you can't just tell everyone why it's broken. You need to, share what you're going to do about it. And so the next approach is to write about systems-based leadership. How do we think about leadership more as a contextual system that isn't one person? So no more are we looking at a singular person as the hero, but leadership as a function within a system. And I'm using Keith Grint's model of problem-based leadership. So where there are three different types of problems, and you either lead, manage, or command, depending on the type of problem you have, and who is required to take on those roles based on skill, capability, being present in the moment, and so forth. And so, are we dealing with wicked problems, tame problems, or critical problems in the moment? Who can handle that? Leadership generally becomes more facilitative as you deal with the wicked problems. Tame problems, or which are not wimpy, they're tame because we know what to do about them. Tame problems require management, and so management requires people to execute. And then critical problems, that's the person being wheeled into the ER in a gurney. You probably don't want your emergency room doctor to say, "Hey, everyone, anyone have an idea what we should do while you're bleeding out on the table?" We want the doctor to take charge. And so that requires command.
So isn't it? Well, leadership, I think, is kind of a lifelong journey of self-awareness and learning about yourself and about how to apply what your strengths are and where your weaknesses are as well, and uh, figuring out what situations where you're good at and what situations you're not. So isn't it about learning about yourself and what style of leadership is best for the moment and for the people around you?
No, I don't think so. No.
No?
Number one, I don't think if we look at history, most of the people we would identify as great leaders in history were all that self-reflective. And certainly most of them didn't take a leadership development program to become great leaders. And I'm not totally sure those who had training when put into a moment to lead were all that great. In contrast, right? In other words, it becomes very hard to predict And highly self-aware people can sometimes become what's the word when you're stuck? Frozen. They
Right.
freeze, right? Or highly self-aware people are able to introspect, empathize, and find the right way to communicate. In other words, the context dictates sometimes whether we want you to be empathic and self-aware, or we just want you to be oblivious to everything and make a decision. And so it's an error for us to say all leadership should be X or all leadership should be Y. We really need to recognize that it's a fluid situation, a fluid dynamic, and it's impossible to predict what we can teach. So, what do I think we should teach then in the absence of having a good prescription we can use? Well, I think systems thinking is a highly, highly useful tool. However, I think we should think about systems thinking in much the way that Brian Klass talks about it, which is that most things are a fluke. And and so even when we're looking at a system, we don't always get to see what's in the entirety of the system. And that might come up and bite us or give us a huge opportunity. We also need to think about creating more intrinsically supportive motivational environments. And that's more of an ethical perspective of leadership. So I'm a big believer in self-determination theory. And so how do we apply autonomy, support, structure for competence, and foster a sense of belonging among people in our environment? Why? Because people who tend to be more intrinsically motivated perform better, more sustainably, and with greater satisfaction. And that, of course, correlates to better leadership outcomes if we can make that happen.
Is there a society or a country that's done that better than others, like Japan with their like the Toyota way is known to uh, be more motivating environment. People tend to be more loyal to the company. Uh, I don't know about other countries, but what do you think
I
about that?
don't know because I'm not sure what the goal is,
Mm.
right? So if our goal is to foster loyalty in our folks, well, then yes, that's achieving something good. But is that a leadership outcome or is that a cultural outcome? Of course, you can't separate them, right? And so what are the factors that are helping to foster that sense of loyalty amongst the team
Well, like
members?
in Japan, they're known to have adopted a more participative style of leadership over the years. And the result, according to what I've read, has been, well, greater efficiency, greater loyalty, uh, less turnover, higher quality product, more profitable company. So there
Yeah, and
must
I
be
think that's
some
one of the
evidence
things
there.
that
Wow.
self-determination theory has been showing some of those outcomes.
Okay.
Right. So when you start to break down why is what you said so valid, well, it's because the structure is fostering a sense of competence. In other words, people know what's expected of them, they know what to do, they know what they have the tools and resources without stress. It's not chaotic. They feel and see the value and meaning and purpose behind what they're doing, so they engage with it more freely, volitionally, and they have a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. And so they feel a part of that community. And I think that would be one of the reasons why. But we see those same needs in other types of cultures. So we see SDT working in terms of need satisfaction across cultures that are less collectivistic, that are still hierarchical. Why? Because sometimes hierarchy gives structure that people are comfortable with. It doesn't feel controlling, it feels safer. And so, depending on how people perceive that. But I think that the challenge with what you just said is not that it's not so and doesn't sound good. It's that sometimes that'll work really well in the context of that day, but as circumstances shift and change, COVID hits, or there's a war, or there are other problems, then all of a sudden that blows up. what's working well in that moment, and you need to change how we're approaching leadership to solve those wicked problems. And so what works today may not work tomorrow. And so we can't just say this is the prescription forever for always. We have to say, okay, it's working in this setting, in this context with these people in this moment. But when we change a variable in that, we don't understand how that cascades through fluke until we're, more cognizant of what the wicked problems are and how we approach them. Keith Grin talks about the need for us to get better acquainted with failure. That we tend to take our titled leaders and hold them accountable for success. But if we really think about it, if leadership's really about navigating through those wicked problems, they fail a lot, which is probably why we don't see CEOs staying around for as long as they used to. Right? CEOs, I think the average tenure now is almost is 5 years,
Yeah, I was just
which
reading
is
something about
pitiful
that as
small
well.
amount,
Yeah.
right? And so that's a problem.
Well, I'm looking forward to the second part, the completion of your
Yeah,
book
me
on
too.
leadership, and hopefully you'll solve that conundrum and
I won't.
you'll
I
become
don't think I
famous
will.
as the leadership guru of all time, and we'll
Yeah,
follow
right.
your
Yeah.
model.
Yeah.
That'll be a
Yeah.
great success for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It won't happen. It's not going to happen. We can all dream.
Positive.
So,
Work towards it. I look
yeah.
forward to it. Well,
So,
Matthew, that is a great conversation. For those interested in learning more about Matthew, I'll put links in the description of this video and also link to the website. It's tayagi.com.
and also ldaccelerator.com.
Yeah, I'm interested in that myself. I'm going to
Yeah.
check that out. That
And
link.
but most people, if you want to connect with me, find me on LinkedIn.
Okay,
LinkedIn is the best way to reach me, and
I'll
I
put
live
that
on
link
LinkedIn.
for your profile as well.
So,
And you also, people can purchase that book off your website as
yeah,
well as
or
others.
you can get it you can get it on Amazon, you can get it in
Oh,
Apple
okay.
Books. You
Oh,
can
okay.
see it's so thick, don't buy the paper, but it is available in any of your countries and any of the bookstores. So,
Fantastic.
and it is in French as
Yeah, and I
well.
do have some of your previous books,
That's great.
the interactive exercise, which I've used extensively, incorporated into my training program. So I really appreciate
Thank you.
that as well. It's been great.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for having me on and putting up with me.
You're welcome. Thank you again. And we'll do another interview once your leadership book is complete and
Super.
published, and we could talk about
Be great.
solutions to all these problems that you
It'll be
mentioned.
great.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you haven't subscribed, I invite you to do so now to the channel and turn on notifications to get news of new videos. And we'll talk again soon. Bye for
Thank you.
now.
Bye, everyone.